Elara stood behind the counter of Miller's Hardware, her hands sorting through a bin of brass screws. The late afternoon sun slanted through the dusty front window, illuminating motes dancing in the air. 68 years hadn't been kind to the storefront, the paint peeled, the sign was faded, but inside, everything had its place. Every hammer, every nail, every length of pipe was meticulously organized. Just like Elara herself. She wasn't tall, and her frame was slight, wrapped in practical, faded overalls. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, etched by time and experiences few in this quiet town could imagine. Most people saw only an elderly woman, running a struggling business. They didn't see the way her eyes constantly scanned, assessing angles and exits, or the quiet economy of movement that spoke of profound, ingrained discipline. They certainly didn't see the woman who, decades ago, moved through shadows and stood on distant lines, a different kind of uniform, her second skin. The town of Harmony Creek had always been sleepy, peaceful. A place where folks knew their neighbors, and the biggest drama was the annual pie competition. But lately, a shadow had fallen over its quiet streets. The Iron Vipers. A biker gang, not large, but loud and mean, had decided Harmony Creek was ripe for picking. They roared through town on their chromed machines, intimidating store owners, pushing around locals, leaving a trail of petty vandalism and growing fear. Their presence was a blight, like rust on well-maintained machinery. Elara watched them from her window sometimes, their swaggering confidence a stark contrast to the slumped shoulders of the townsfolk. She saw the fear, smelled the arrogance. It reminded her of things she'd spent years trying to forget, places where bullies weren't just loud, they were lethal. A quiet anger, cold and steady, began to simmer beneath her calm exterior. One sweltering Tuesday, the peace of Miller's Hardware was shattered not by the distant rumble of engines, but by their immediate, deafening roar outside the front door. 3 bikes pulled up, their riders dismounting with practiced menace. Leather-clad, heavily tattooed, they stomped into the store, their boots tracking grease onto Elara's clean floorboards. The leader, a hulking brute with a tangled beard and eyes like chips of black ice, wore a vest that read "Hammer" over the Iron Viper's logo. 2 others, younger and leaner, flanked him, smirking. "Well, looky here," Hammer's voice was a gravelly growl that bounced off the tool displays. "A hardware store. Perfect. We need some supplies." He sauntered towards the counter, running a grimy hand along a display of delicate woodworking tools. One of the younger men kicked over a stack of garden pots near the door with a laugh. The other snatched a hammer from a rack, hefting it experimentally. "Hey lady," Hammer sneered, leaning over the counter, his face too close. "You got anything useful in this junk heap? Like, maybe some things for persuasion?" Elara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Her hands remained steady as she continued sorting screws. "We have tools for building, sir," she said, her voice soft but clear. "And for repair." Hammer threw back his head and laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. His companions joined in, their noise filling the small space. "Building? Repair?" Hammer scoffed. "We ain't building nothing. We just take what we want." He slammed a fist onto the counter, making the old wood groan. "And we want respect. Something this town ain't been giving us." The biker holding the hammer swung it carelessly, hitting a rack of wrenches, sending them clattering to the floor. The other picked up a box of nails and poured them onto the counter. "Come on, Grandma," the one who kicked the pots jeered. "Show us some respect. Or maybe we'll teach you a lesson about who runs things now." Elara looked from the scattered nails to the downed wrenches, then to the 3 sneering faces. The quiet anger she felt solidified into something cold and sharp. It was the familiar clarity of a threat assessment, the sudden, pinpoint focus she hadn't needed in years. "My tools," she said, her voice still quiet, but with an underlying current that silenced their laughter, "are not for your games." Hammer's eyes narrowed. He didn't like the lack of fear in her voice. He reached across the counter, grabbing a handful of her overalls. "Listen here, old woman," he snarled, pulling her forward. "You ain't got no idea who you're messing with." It happened faster than the eye could follow. One moment Hammer had his hand on her, the next he was flying backward, landing hard on the floor amidst scattered nails. Elara hadn't twisted, hadn't struggled. Her hand had moved, a blur of motion, connecting with a pressure point on his wrist and shoulder. Precise. Devastatingly effective. The two other bikers froze, their smirks vanishing, replaced by stunned disbelief. Hammer lay on the floor, gasping, clutching his arm. Before they could react, Elara moved again. She didn't run or shout. She simply stepped around the counter, a yardstick now in her hand. Not as a weapon, but as an extension of her reach. The biker with the hammer found it expertly flicked from his grasp, clattering away. As he lunged for her, she sidestepped, her foot sweeping his support leg out from under him. He crashed down beside Hammer. The third biker, the one who'd kicked the pots, backed away slowly, his eyes wide. Elara turned towards him, the yardstick held loosely. She didn't say a word, but the look in her eyes was enough. It wasn't anger he saw, but something far more unnerving, calm, absolute capability. He saw someone who knew exactly how to hurt him, and wasn't afraid to do it. He stumbled backward, past the knocked-over pots, and sprinted out the door. Hammer and the other man, groaning and dazed, scrambled to their feet and hobbled out after him, leaving behind a mess of scattered nails, fallen wrenches, and a stunned silence. Elara stood in the doorway, watching their bikes roar away down the street. She noticed, high up on the wall near the ceiling, the faded wooden plaque, Miller's Hardware, founded by Elara Vance. Vance. It wasn't just her first name. They had seen her last name. The name from the founder's plaque. The one that whispered, for those who knew the local history, of something far older and harder than this quiet town might suggest. Something connected to the military base 40 miles away. The silence in the store hummed, heavy with the sudden, impossible truth of what had just happened. Elara calmly stepped back inside and began picking up the scattered nails, her movements as methodical as ever, but now imbued with a different kind of energy. The piece was broken. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that the Iron Vipers would be back. This was just the beginning. Hammer and his remaining men regrouped at their temporary base of operations, a derelict auto garage on the outskirts of town. Hammer was nursing his throbbing wrist, his face contorted in a mix of pain and fury. "That old hag," he roared, kicking over a stack of tires. "She broke my wrist. My damn wrist." The two who had been with him shifted uncomfortably. "Boss, she moved weird," one mumbled. "Like, not old weird. Fast weird." "Fast?" Hammer spat. "She's a brittle old lady. She got lucky." His eyes fell on the third biker, who was still shaken. "You. Why the hell did you run?" "She looked at me, boss," the biker stammered. Like nothing scared her. "And her name?" "Vance. I think I heard that name before. Around the base. Something about a legend." Hammer stared at him. "A legend? What are you talking about?" "I don't know, just talk," the man insisted, though his fear was palpable. "But that name, and the way she moved. Boss, she ain't just some hardware lady." Hammer sneered, dismissing the fear in his lieutenant's eyes. He stood up, testing his wrist. It hurt like hell, but the humiliation burned hotter. An old woman had made him look foolish. In front of his own men. This couldn't stand. This wouldn't stand. "Legend or not," he growled, rubbing his wrist. "She needs to learn who's in charge. And she needs to pay for this. And the rest of this town needs to see what happens when they stand up to us." He grinned, a cruel, broken-toothed smile. "Time to make an example. A big 1 inch. Back at Miller's Hardware, Elara worked late, cleaning up the mess. The brief skirmish had shattered the illusion of her quiet life. It was a threshold crossed. She was no longer just the hardware store owner, she was, once again, the protector. Her mind, sharp and disciplined, began sifting through possibilities. The Iron Vipers weren't just thugs. Their structure, their methods, the way Hammer carried himself, it spoke of more than just local hooliganism. She needed information. What exactly were they doing in Harmony Creek? Who were they connected to? What was the full extent of their operation? Elara started subtly. She listened to the hushed conversations of customers, piecing together rumors and complaints. She observed the patterns of the bikers' movements through town. At night, she didn't just lock up, she secured the store, checking entry points, setting simple, effective deterrents learned long ago in places where security wasn't a suggestion, but survival. Her research wasn't limited to local gossip. She knew how to access information, even from the quiet corners of the internet. She looked into the Iron Vipers' history, their known associates, their activities in other areas. What she found was disturbing. They weren't just a local chapter, they were a node in a larger criminal network, involved in drug distribution and, more recently and sickeningly, using small towns like Harmony Creek as waypoints for something far more vile. Human trafficking. The scale of their operation was larger than she had initially suspected. And it explained the fear that permeated the town. The Vipers weren't just taking, they were corrupting, silencing, exploiting. The stakes had just risen exponentially. This wasn't just about protecting her store or getting rid of bullies. It was about liberating her town from a profound evil. She couldn't do this alone. Her particular skill set was formidable, but she wasn't a one-woman army anymore, nor did she want to be. Conflict had taught her the invaluable strength of a team. She thought of the people in Harmony Creek. Who among them had the backbone, the skill, the willingness to fight? There was Frank, who ran the gas station down the road. Gruff, quiet, but Elara had seen the way he carried himself, the way his eyes scanned everything. He wore a faded Marine Corps cap sometimes. And there was Clara, who owned the diner. Beneath her warm smile and endless coffee refills, Elara sensed a core of steel. Clara's son had left town years ago, running from trouble, and Elara knew Clara carried that pain and fiercely protected what little family she had left here. Most promisingly, perhaps, was Deputy Miller. No relation to the store's original owners from Elara's family, he was a young, earnest man. Elara had seen his frustration dealing with the Vipers, how his hands were tied by procedure and the implicit threat the gang represented. But he was honest. And he represented a crucial link to legitimacy, if they could navigate the corruption. Elara began subtly testing the waters. She stopped by Frank's station, making small talk, watching him. She'd mention the Vipers, gauging his reaction. She'd bring up the past, the military, seeing if he responded. With Deputy Miller, she was more direct, but cautious. She shared small, verifiable pieces of information about the Viper's activities, framed as a concerned citizen. She watched to see if he acted on it, if he was truly independent or compromised. Frank responded first. One evening, after the station closed, he knocked on her back door. He didn't preamble. "Heard about what you did to Hammer," Frank said, his voice low. "Caught him down at the clinic today. Doc said it looked like a textbook joint manipulation injury. Army Ranger stuff, maybe." He looked Elara up and down, a slow, assessing gaze. "You didn't learn that sorting screws, Elara." Elara smiled faintly. "No, Frank. I learned it where keeping things organized meant you went home at night." Frank nodded. "Vipers are talking big. Say they're gonna burn your store down. Make you an example." He paused. "They ain't just roughnecks, Elara. I seen new faces lately. Harder faces. Folks I don't recognize from the county. They're bringing in heavier stuff. And they're pushing people. Hard. I know, Elara said. I've been looking into it. It's more than just a local gang. Frank met her eyes. I don't like bullies. Never did, he paused, then added, 30 years, Marine Corps. Didn't see much combat, mostly logistics and engineering, but I learned how to build things solid. And how to break things that ain't. Elara nodded. Harmony Creek needs fixing, Frank. Not just hardware. Yeah, he said, a flicker of fire in his tired eyes. Yeah, it does. Clara was next. Elara simply brought her coffee to the diner, sitting at the counter, listening. Clara poured her a refill, her face tight with worry. Those vipers, Clara murmured, keeping her voice low. They threatened Billy down at the bakery today. Said his oven might have an accident if he doesn't pay protection. People are terrified, Elara, she leaned closer. My boy, he ran because he got mixed up with folks like this in the city. I lost him once. I won't lose this town too, her gaze was fierce. I can't fight, not like I hear you can. But I know everyone. I know who's scared, who's hurting. And I know how to listen. Information is a weapon, Clara, Elara said gently. Fear is their shield. We need to take away the fear. Deputy Miller was the trickiest. Elara fed him fragmented, deniable tips, a strange car seen late at the abandoned mill, unusual patterns of activity. She watched as he tried to investigate, but each time he got close, he seemed to hit a wall. Finally, she decided on a calculated risk. She walked into the sheriff's office when Miller was alone. She sat down across from his desk, her hands clasped calmly. Deputy, she began. Those vipers are more than just a nuisance. They are moving drugs through Harmony Creek. And worse, she lowered her voice. I have reason to believe they are involved in human trafficking. Miller's face went pale. Ms. Vance, that's a serious accusation. I don't make frivolous accusations, Deputy, she said. I've seen things. Heard things. Things you wouldn't believe a town like this was capable of hiding, she leaned forward slightly. Are you able to investigate this, Deputy? Truly investigate it? Without interference? Miller looked down at his desk, then back at her, his eyes troubled. There's pressure, Ms. Vance. From higher up. They want us to just keep the peace, not stir things up. Especially with the vipers. There are connections. Elara nodded slowly. Corruption. As she suspected. Then perhaps, she said, standing up, the peace they want isn't the peace this town needs, she looked him directly in the eye. Harmony Creek is hurting, Deputy. It needs protecting. Are you the law this town deserves, or the law they're being forced to accept? She left him sitting there, the weight of her words hanging in the air. A day later, Miller showed up at her back door with Frank and Clara. He looked exhausted, but his jaw was set. I can't fight the whole department, Miller admitted. Not officially. But I can fight for this town. Off the books. You were, in the service, Ms. Vance. Frank told me. A long time ago, Deputy, Elara confirmed. In places that make Harmony Creek feel like a dream. Heard you were quite something, Miller said, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Frank says you're the real deal. So is Clara. She knows everyone, hears everything. My badge might be compromised at the top, but I still know how police work gets done. I know procedures, response times, who's clean in the county and who isn't. Elara looked at the three of them, the quiet, sturdy veteran gas station owner, the perceptive, fierce diner owner, the conflicted but principled young lawman. A nascent team. They weren't the force she once commanded, but they had courage and purpose. It was a start. All right, Elara said, her voice regaining a tone of quiet authority she hadn't used in years. Then let's talk about rebuilding Harmony Creek. starting with clearing out the infestation. The iron vipers, meanwhile, were smarting from their humiliation. Hammer's wrist was bandaged, his temper short. He paced the garage floor, barking orders. "She thinks she's tough," he snarled. "We'll show her tough. We'll show this whole damn town." They escalated quickly. They firebombed the vacant storefront next to Billy's bakery as a warning. They beat up a young man who'd been vocal about standing up to them, leaving him hospitalized. They rode their bikes through the town square at all hours, shattering windows and screaming threats. Their goal was simple: break the town's spirit, reassert dominance through terror. "Hammer's getting sloppy," Elara observed during their first planning session. They were gathered in the back room of Miller's Hardware, maps of Harmony Creek spread out on a workbench. Frank stood watch outside. Clara brought coffee and quiet updates on the town's mood. Deputy Miller provided details on police patrols and potential blind spots. "He's reacting emotionally," Elara continued, pointing to key locations on the map. "That makes him predictable. But they've brought in reinforcements. At least 3 more, judging by the new bikes and faces Clara's seen at the diner." She traced a finger along the map's edges. "And the mill, that's where they're running the main operation from." Deputy Miller confirmed unusual traffic patterns there. "Heavy trucks late at night." "We can't assault a fortified position," Frank said, his gaze serious. "Not with just us." "We don't," Elara said. "We don't meet them where they're strongest. We hit them where they're weakest. Their support structure. Their confidence. Their fear." Her plan began to take shape. It wasn't about brute force, but precision. Hit the supply lines, disrupt their communications, sow chaos and distrust within their ranks, and finally, isolate Hammer and his core group. Deputy Miller confirmed that a county task force was sniffing around the edges of the larger criminal network, but they were weeks, maybe months, away from hitting Harmony Creek. They were on their own. "The local sheriff is still blocking me officially," Miller said, frustration playing on his face. "He gets a kickback, I'm sure of it. But I can coordinate things. Keep patrols away from certain areas at certain times. Feed information to the county guys indirectly." "Clara," Elara turned to her. "You know the townsfolk. Who's scared, who's angry? Who might be willing to help, even in small ways? Providing lookouts, hiding places, maybe just keeping quiet about what they see." Clara nodded. "They're scared, but they're also fed up. They've seen what you did, Elara. What the Vipers did afterwards. People are starting to talk less about fear, more about fighting back. Billy from the bakery, Old Man Hemlock, even young Timmy who runs the grocery deliveries. They're ready." "Good," Elara said. "We need their eyes and ears. We need them to know they aren't alone." Just as their plan was solidifying, the Iron Vipers made their biggest move yet. A large, heavily reinforced transport truck arrived at the abandoned mill under cover of darkness. Deputy Miller managed to get close enough to see a dozen new faces disembarking, harder, colder men than Hammer's usual crew. They were professionals. This wasn't just a gang operation anymore. This was a serious, organized criminal enterprise, using the Vipers as local muscle and the mill as a hub for their illicit activities. The stakes weren't just local peace, lives were at risk, potentially many of them. Miller relayed the information, his voice grim. "These aren't bikers, Elara. These are, security. Heavy hitters. The kind you don't want to mess with." The news cast a pall over the planning session. The odds had just lengthened considerably. Elara looked at her allies, their faces etched with worry but also determination. Frank, quietly calculating risks. Clara, her eyes filled with fierce protective love for her town. Miller, wrestling with the limitations of his badge. They underestimated Harmony Creek, Elara said, her voice steady, cutting through the tension. They saw a quiet town, easy to exploit. They didn't see the people who live here. People who built this place, who love it. People who have backbone. She looked at each of them in turn. We aren't soldiers in a foreign land anymore, Frank. We aren't serving coffee or writing tickets, Clara and Deputy. We're defending our home. Our friends. Our neighbors. This isn't about glory or medals. It's about doing what's right, here, now, for the people who can't fight for themselves. Her words weren't a rousing speech, but a quiet statement of fact, delivered with the absolute conviction of someone who had lived by those principles. It resonated deeply. Frank straightened, his military bearing returning. Clara's eyes hardened with resolve. Miller's shoulders relaxed slightly, the internal conflict easing as his purpose became clear. They think power comes from fear and violence, Elara continued. They don't understand that true strength comes from standing together. From protecting something you love. From earning respect, not demanding it. So what's the plan, Ms. Vance? Frank asked, his voice firm. Against this? He gestured broadly, encompassing the new, larger threat. Elara returned to the map, her finger resting on the symbol for the mill. We adapt, she said. The core strategy remains. Cut off the head, the body withers. Hammer and his original Vipers are still the local leadership, the connection to this town. The security at the mill is guarding the main operation, yes. But they're probably not expecting a direct, unconventional assault here, in their safe haven. She outlined adjustments to the plan, incorporating the new information, leveraging the Allies' strengths, and focusing on disruption and misdirection before the final confrontation. It was dangerous. It was likely they would be outnumbered and outgunned. But it was a plan. And for the first time in a long time, facing a threat not on a distant battlefield but on her own main street, Elara felt a familiar sense of grim purpose settle over her. The quiet life was over. It was time to remember who she was. Here is a story about Harmony Creek. A quiet town facing down a storm. Tell us, where are you watching from as this fight unfolds? The plan went into motion under the cloak of darkness. Elara, Frank, and a small group of the most capable citizens Frank had quietly vetted, mostly other older veterans, their skills rusty but present, and a few younger townsfolk tired of the fear, began the initial phase, disruption. They weren't launching a frontal assault. Elara's strategy was born of experience, hit them where they were weak, where they were scattered. Frank, using his knowledge of mechanics and basic demolitions, the non-lethal kind, led a team that disabled several of the Viper's bikes parked away from the garage, flattening tires, cutting essential wires. Not enough to cripple them entirely, but enough to cause chaos and frustration. Clara's network provided crucial intelligence. Word came through her delivery boy, Timmy, who saw Vipers congregating at a small, unused warehouse near the old rail line, likely setting up a secondary distribution point. Deputy Miller, claiming an anonymous tip about suspicious activity, routed the single night patrol to the opposite side of town for a crucial window of time. Elara, accompanied by Frank, approached the warehouse. They didn't break in. Instead, Elara, using tools from her store and techniques for bypassing simple security, bypassed the lock and slipped inside. They weren't there to fight. Elara located the stash of drugs the Vipers were preparing. She didn't steal them. Instead, using chemicals she'd carefully acquired, she expertly contaminated the entire batch, rendering it worthless and dangerous. It was a silent, unseen strike at the heart of the Vipers' local business. As dawn approached, the Allies reported back. Bikes disabled, a drug shipment ruined. Small victories, but they would cause significant friction within the Vipers, especially between Hammer and the new, professional security contingent who were likely less tolerant of such amateur setbacks. Hammer's reaction was immediate and predictable. He was furious. Discovering the disabled bikes and the ruined drugs sent him into a rage. The professional security team, led by a cold, efficient man named Marcus, was less than impressed. Local problem, Hammer, Marcus stated flatly, surveying the mess at the garage. Your problem. Fix it. This kind of sloppy disruption is unacceptable. Hammer, already nursing his wrist and bruised ego from Elara, felt the pressure. He lashed out. The Vipers rode through town, smashing windows at businesses that had shown defiance, vandalizing the town square again, beating up anyone who looked at them wrong. They wanted to reassert their terror, show the town they were still in charge, that their power hadn't been broken. They specifically targeted Clara's diner. They broke windows, overturned tables, and spray-painted the Iron Viper's logo across the front door. Clara stood outside, tears streaming down her face, as the Vipers rode away laughing. Seeing Clara's diner, a symbol of the town's warmth and community, vandalized hit the town hard. But instead of breaking their spirit, it ignited something else. Anger. Righteous indignation. The next morning, before the sun was even high, townsfolk gathered at the diner. Billy from the bakery brought pastries. Man Hemlock showed up with his toolbox. Timmy organized a cleanup crew. Deputy Miller, unable to assist officially, arrived in plain clothes and quietly helped sweep glass. People who had been cowering in their homes came out, brooms and buckets in hand. They weren't just cleaning, they were making a statement. They were defying the Vipers. Clara, watching her neighbors work, her face streaked with dirt and tears, felt a surge of hope she hadn't felt in years. This was her town. These were her people. And they were fighting back. Elara watched from her store window, a faint, proud smile on her lips. The town wasn't just relying on her and her small group of allies anymore. They were finding their own courage. The shield of fear was cracking. This act of community resilience fueled the allies. They knew the Vipers' counterattack meant their disruptions were working, but it also meant the danger was escalating rapidly. Hammer was desperate, Marcus was impatient. It was time for the next phase. They needed to lure the main force out, specifically Hammer and his core group, away from the protection of the professional security at the mill and their reinforced garage. Elara devised the trap. It centered on Miller's hardware itself. Hammer wants revenge on me, Elara explained during their final strategy meeting back at the store. He wants to burn this place down. He sees it as the symbol of his humiliation. We use that. The plan was intricate, relying on timing, misdirection, and the Viper's predictable arrogance. Clara's network would spread a rumor, a false one, that Elara had received a large shipment of expensive, hard-to-get tools, delivered discreetly to the hardware store. This was bait. Tools were currency for a gang, the rumor of a valuable score would appeal to their greed, especially now that their drug operation was compromised and they needed to reassert their criminal credibility. Deputy Miller, again routing official patrols elsewhere, would create a window for the attack. Frank and his veterans would be positioned strategically around the store and neighboring buildings, ready to cut off escape routes and provide backup. The younger townsfolk would serve as lookouts, using a simple system of signals. Elara would be the primary lure, inside the store. They'll come fast and hard, Elara explained, tracing a route on the map towards her store. Confident they're hitting a soft target. They won't expect resistance here. Not like this. Frank looked concerned. It's a tight space, Elara. Risky. Controlled environment, Elara corrected. I know every inch of this store. Every blind spot, every tool's weight and balance. They don't, she met his gaze, her eyes steady. This is my ground, Frank. My terms. Marcus, the head of the security team at the mill, was suspicious of Hammer's sudden obsession with an old hardware store. It smells like a setup, he told Hammer, who was itching for revenge. Why focus on some old lady when we have the operation to protect? She ruined our drugs. She embarrassed me. Hammer roared. And that shipment, it's worth a lot. More than enough to make up for the loss. We hit the store, get the score, make an example of her. Simple. Marcus remained unconvinced, but his orders were to let Hammer handle local problems unless they impacted the main operation at the mill. He reluctantly agreed to let Hammer take most of the original Vipers, keeping his own professional team back at the mill as primary security. This played perfectly into Alara's strategy, separating Hammer from his more dangerous reinforcements. As dusk settled over Harmony Creek, a tense quiet descended. Lights went out early in houses along Main Street. Everyone knew something was coming. They were scared, but they were also watching, waiting, and for the first time, many of them were ready. The rumble started distant, then grew into a roar. 5 bikes, carrying Hammer and his most loyal Vipers, tore down Main Street, headlights cutting through the dim light. They screeched to a halt outside Miller's Hardware, the smell of gasoline and exhaust filling the air. Hammer dismounted, grinning, a crowbar in his hand. "Time to collect," he yelled to his men. They surged towards the front door. It was locked, but not reinforced. Hammer raised the crowbar, ready to smash the glass. Suddenly, from the darkness across the street, a single, high-pitched whistle cut through the air. It was the signal. "Ambush," one of the Vipers yelled, startled. Hammer hesitated for a split second, his confidence wavering. But the lure of revenge and the promised score, coupled with his inherent arrogance, won out. Inside, he roared. "They can't stop all of us." He smashed the glass, splintering the frame. The Vipers poured into the store, weapons drawn, chains, pipes, knives, a couple of handguns. The inside of Miller's Hardware was plunged into near darkness, Alara having turned off the main lights. Only slivers of moonlight and the Vipers' flashlights pierced the gloom, creating dancing shadows. "Miller!" Hammer yelled, his voice echoing. "Come on out, old hag. Time to pay." Silence answered him. The Vipers fanned out, cautiously at first, then bolder as the silence stretched. They began smashing displays, kicking over shelves, venting their rage. Suddenly, a single sound echoed, the sharp snap of a toolbox lid closing. It came from the back of the store. "There." Hammer pointed. 3 Vipers moved towards the sound. As they passed a tall shelf of paint cans, one of the cans suddenly tilted, sending a cascade of metal tins tumbling down. The Vipers jumped back, startled, slipping on a strategically placed patch of ball bearings Alara had scattered. As they struggled, Alara moved through the shadows. She didn't carry a gun. She didn't need one. Her weapons were the store itself and her own body, honed over years into a precision instrument. She moved with preternatural quietness, a ghost in her own domain. A Viper recovering from the ball bearing suddenly cried out as a heavy wrench swung from the darkness, hitting his hand with bone-jarring force. He dropped his weapon, clutching his broken fingers. Another tripped over a coil of rope, landing hard. As he tried to rise, Alara was there, not with a blow, but a swift, disabling joint lock using the handle of a push broom. Hammer and the remaining Vipers heard the sounds of their men being systematically taken down in the darkness. Fear, cold and sharp, began to replace their bravado. "What the hell is going on?" Hammer roared, spinning around, trying to find his unseen attacker. From the shadows behind the counter, Alara emerged. She wasn't holding a weapon, just standing calmly, her expression unreadable. The dim light caught the steely glint in her eyes. "You came here to take," Alara said, her voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "You should have come here to learn." Hammer lunged at her, blinded by rage. He swung the crowbar wildly. Alara didn't evade. She moved into his attack, deflecting the blow with a forearm reinforced by years of training, simultaneously stepping inside his reach. Her hand snaked out, finding another pressure point on his arm, a different kind than before. It wasn't meant to break this time. It was meant to paralyze, to control. Hammer cried out as the strength drained from his arm. Alara spun him around, his own momentum used against him, guiding him towards a display of garden tools. She didn't shove him. She directed his movement with precise pressure, forcing him to stumble. He crashed into a rack of shovels and rakes, knocking them everywhere. His remaining vipers, seeing their leader overwhelmed by an old woman, hesitated. That was all the time Ilara's allies needed. The back door burst open, and Frank, along with a few other veterans, poured in, armed with reinforced tool handles, lengths of pipe, and their own quiet determination. They moved with purpose, engaging the scattered vipers. The front door glass, already broken, shattered completely as Deputy Miller, badge displayed now, and the younger townsfolk rushed in, ready to help secure the perimeters and contain the fight. The hardware store became a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Ilara, still grappling with the semi-paralyzed Hammer, used her surroundings with deadly efficiency. She slammed his weakened arm against a sturdy workbench. She tripped him over a bag of cement. She used her knowledge of the store's layout to keep him disoriented, anticipating his clumsy attacks, turning his own bulk and rage against him. Frank and the other veterans engaged the remaining vipers. They weren't martial artists, but they were tough, determined, and they fought with the ferocity of people defending their home. A retired welder used a heavy pipe like a staff, keeping 2 vipers at bay. An older woman, a former military nurse, moved surprisingly fast, using a length of rope to entangle a man's legs. They fought smart, leveraging the environment and their numbers against the vipers' disorganization and shock. Deputy Miller and the townsfolk secured the entrances, preventing escape, shouting for the vipers to surrender. Hammer, disarmed and battered, finally collapsed near the back of the store, panting, defeated. Ilara stood over him, breathing steadily, showing no signs of exertion. "You came to take my store," she said, her voice calm despite the surrounding sounds of struggle. "And my town," she gestured around the chaotic store, the sounds of her allies subduing the remaining vipers. "But you found out," she finished, her gaze unwavering, "that some things aren't for sale. And some people aren't to be underestimated." One by one, the remaining vipers were disarmed and zip-tied by Frank and the veterans. Deputy Miller, once the fight was clearly over, officially took charge, radioing the county sheriff, the one who was clean, about a major incident and multiple arrests involving the Iron Vipers and evidence of a larger criminal operation. The trap was sprung. The Iron Vipers' local chapter was finished. Hammer was defeated, not by a bigger bully, but by the quiet strength he had so foolishly dismissed. The immediate aftermath in Miller's hardware was a strange mix of adrenaline and stunned silence. The fighting stopped. The only sounds were heavy breathing, the rustle of zip ties, and Deputy Miller speaking urgently into his radio. The defeated Iron Vipers lay sprawled amidst overturned displays, their arrogance replaced by pain and disbelief. Ilara stood calmly near the back, watching as Frank and the veterans secured the prisoners. Her face was calm, showing only a flicker of weariness. She glanced at the damage to her store, broken glass, scattered tools, paint cans everywhere. It would be a lot of work to fix. But it was just property. The important thing was the town. County Sheriff Brody arrived less than an hour later with a contingent of clean deputies. He took one look at the scene, the defeated bikers, Deputy Miller in charge, Ilara standing quietly by, and understood instantly. He knew Deputy Miller was good, and he'd been suspicious of the local sheriff's inaction regarding the Vipers for months. "Ms. Vance," Sheriff Brody said, his voice respectful. Deputy Miller filled me in. "Looks like you and your neighbors did this town a service." Ilara nodded. "They tried to take what wasn't theirs, Sheriff. The town decided it wasn't going to let them." As the Vipers were led out in handcuffs, blinking in the early morning light, many townsfolk emerged from their homes, watching. Fear was gone from their faces, replaced by tentative relief and a quiet sense of victory. They saw Hammer, the feared leader, looking pathetic and defeated. They saw Ilara, the unassuming hardware store owner, standing tall, a quiet strength radiating from her. Over the next few days, Sheriff Brody and his team, armed with the evidence secured at Miller's hardware and the intelligence Deputy Miller had gathered, moved on the abandoned mill. They found Marcus and his professional security team, who offered little resistance once they realized the extent of the Viper's collapse and the arrival of official law enforcement. The human trafficking operation was shut down, and victims were safely recovered. It was a major blow to the larger criminal network. Back in Harmony Creek, the cleanup began. It wasn't just the hardware store. People started fixing the damage to the diner, the bakery, the windows along Main Street. It became a town-wide effort. Neighbors helping neighbors, sharing tools, sharing food, sharing stories of the night the quiet old woman and her friends stood up to the bullies. Elara spent her days sweeping glass and straightening shelves. Her allies helped. Frank was a wizard at fixing the broken door frame. Clara brought food for everyone working. Deputy Miller stopped by when he could, helping carry heavy items, talking about the ongoing investigation and the arrests. The corrupt local sheriff was quickly exposed and removed. Harmony Creek would get a new, honest law enforcement presence. One afternoon, as they worked, Frank leaned against a counter. "You know," he said quietly to Elara. "Back in the Corps, we had legends. Ghost stories about operators who could disappear and reappear like smoke, take down a whole squad with just a knife and some wire." He paused, looking at her. "Never thought I'd meet one." Elara just smiled faintly, dusting off a hammer. "Just a person doing what needed doing, Frank." "Yeah, well," he chuckled softly. "Some folks need to learn that quiet doesn't mean weak. And old doesn't mean helpless." The narrative of Harmony Creek's stand spread. It wasn't just a local incident. A small town, led by an unlikely hero, had driven out organized crime. It became a story of courage, of community, and of earned respect. Elara Vance remained the quiet owner of Miller's Hardware. Her overalls were still faded, her hair still pulled back in a bun. But now, when people looked at her, they saw more than just an old woman. They saw strength. They saw a protector. They saw the person who reminded them that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. The sign outside Miller's Hardware might still be faded, but inside, and throughout Harmony Creek, things were being repaired. Foundations were being strengthened. And the sense of peace that settled over the town was deeper, truer than before. It was a peace that had been fought for, earned with unity and quiet strength, proving that even the most unassuming person, with the right skills and unwavering resolve, could stand against the darkness and bring the light back home. Miller's Hardware became more than just a store, it became a symbol of the town's resilience, a quiet monument to the day an old woman buying tools showed everyone what true power looked like.